All right, today's lecture is going to introduce the first environmental dimension, which is the physical environment. So when I think about the 9 dimensions of the person environment over time, specifically the environment dimensions, I kind of think like how I organize them in my head and kind of how I teach them is kind of going from the biggest scope down to the narrow. So the first one we start with is the physical environment, which is kind of the whole entire world, all the way down to the last one, which is the dyads, which is just a one-on-one person relationship. So if that kind of helps to organize the direction that we're going, we're going to start with this huge macro piece and kind of funnel it down to the very small specific environmental piece. So we're going to tackle the physical environment today, and there's not going to be a ton of video lecture content, only because I'm going to have kind of an interactive activity that you guys will be responsible for completing with the content in this video. So physical environment, there's a couple different ways to look at the physical environment. So there's the natural environment, which is kind of what I personally naturally think about when I think about the environment in the physical world. It's kind of that natural or nature environment. And so this is the portion of the physical environment influenced by geological or non-human biological forces. So this would be mountains, grass, lakes, rivers, mountains, the air, the environment, the ozone, anything that's kind of, I guess, associated with nature and that man hasn't incorporated into the physical world themselves. It's important to kind of know that there's a distinction of environment because different types of environments have different roles for different people. So many benefits to spending time in the natural environment. There is the stimulation theory research kind of focuses on the benefits of being in nature. Often when we talk about self-care, one of the things that people often identify is going out into nature or spending time outside, and that there's like a spiritual element to being in the natural environment. So it's really good to know that this is a huge piece of how people can find peace or meaning or centered or groundedness, and that it can really influence how they might behave or act. And so I was watching a video earlier today. There was an interview about with this gentleman who lives in downtown Grand Rapids, and he used to be living out on a ranch in a different state, kind of out west in the mountains, and just the difficulty of his world now. He's homeless and on the streets, and how he yearns just to go buy a horse again and be back out in that natural environment. And so it can be a really big shell shock for individuals who are used to open spaces to then all of a sudden be in more of an urban or man-made environment. My nephews grew up in Dawson, Minnesota, which is very, very farm-centric, very, very rural, and they are very energetic young children, and they would often, well, not often, they very frequently are punching each other, beating up each other, yelling at each other, swearing at each other. I love them dearly, but they are definitely 3 boys with lots of energy. So when they were out in Minnesota, they didn't have any neighbors close by. And so when they were, like if the parents were not home, oftentimes they just run wild, beating each other up, yelling, screaming. They were totally fine because they were playing and acting like boys, but no one was concerned about their well-being or interpreting their yells and screams and swearings as something negative or harmful because no one was physically around. Well, now they've since moved to Manistee here in Michigan, where they live like in downtown Manistee. So a very like village type feeling. And the other day the parents were gone. My brother-in-law is a pastor, and mom was doing something. And they were doing their normal yelling, screaming, fighting, swearing, kicking, while some strange lady comes to the door and is knocking because she's concerned about their welfare. And it freaked him out because they weren't used to that. And so I just thought that was a really interesting example of how this like natural versus urban environment can really be interesting to navigate when you're used to one or the other. And I just thought that was kind of a funny vignette to share. So the opposite of a natural environment is the built environment. So this is the portion of your physical environment attributed solely to human effort. So this is buildings, this is bridges, this is anything humans have introduced into the natural environment and kind of built on their own. And so the intent of the built environment is to create comfort and controllability. However, there have been negative effects. So if you think about the environment and global warming and the icebergs and the research showing that they're melting and how that impacts the world, a huge push in social work right now is environmental justice. And what roles do social workers have in promoting good policies that protect the environment, because it's a huge part, obviously, of who we are and how we manage behavior. And so we just have to be really mindful of, although the built environment might have positive intent, it also can have some negatives that we really need to be aware of as part of our profession and a push for social justice. All right, so I was thinking about, in regards to the built or the physical environment, obviously one of the things we think about is housing and how we navigate that and how the built environment has attributed to comfort and providing housing. But what does that do for individuals who don't necessarily have access to housing, or that part of their physical environment is unstable? So I pose a question of what you would do if you found yourself homeless in Grand Rapids. And so maybe the reasonable, natural plan, well, I would just go to a shelter. There's homeless shelters everywhere downtown. I would go to that, or I would just stay with a family or friend until I was able to find help from an agency or save money for a deposit for a house or apartment. Like I would just get off the streets that way. And in theory, those sound like a very reasonable plan of action to try to get your needs of your physical environment met. However, thinking about homeless services in Grand Rapids has 3 main shelters for adults. So Guiding Light, that's a men's only shelter. And in order to stay there, you must commit to a work program. Dégagé, that has primarily women and some children. It's primarily women's shelter. Actually, I don't think children can go there, so I take that back. It is a women's shelter. At the time when I was researching this, there's only 40 beds. That may have changed because it's been a year or so, but that's the information I found. Your length of stay can vary. You must create a plan if your stay is going to be longer than 3 days. So you have to create goals. You have to usually searching for a job or figuring out how to save money or finding someone to live with while you can save for housing. They also must, this is always the interesting thing, in order to reserve your spot for the night, you often have to get in line early in the day and wait to sign up for a spot. So this is not necessarily like an impulsive thing, like, oh, I have nowhere to go, I just get kicked out of my house, I need to go stay there. There's some planning involved that you have to be able to get to the shelter. You have to be able to wait in line. So if it's cold, it's not going to be a pleasant thing. And you also don't know that you're going to get a bed even after waiting. And curfew, you have to be back in the shelter at 9 p.m. and you must leave the shelter for the day by 7:45 a.m. So you're not even physically able to stay there during the day because it's intended for you to go out and find a job or work on the goals that you've created. Mel Trotter is also a third one. There's beds available for males, females, and family beds, but it is not a drop-in shelter either. So those are kind of the sheltering options in Grand Rapids. Again, there may be some newer ones that I don't know of. There's AYA is one that's targeted at youth who are experiencing homelessness. They do have one like transitional housing where there has to be referrals. It's not a drop-in shelter, but AYA focuses on helping provide a safe place during the day for homeless teens and youth. But there is no overnight component outside of the transitional housing that people can become part of with a referral. So this is the shelter kind of vibe that's going on. Also, in order to access the resources for referrals, Salvation Army, the Housing Assistance Program, is like gatekeeper. So it's kind of like instead of having to go to every single different agency in the community, you go to HAP and they do an assessment process, and then they refer you out because they kind of hold all they're like kind of the one-stop shop to be able to go get referrals to different agencies. So it's intended to be a hub and make it a little bit easier just to go to one place and then get referred out from there. Now, there's mixed reviews on the effectiveness and efficiency. Sometimes it's just due to like there's no funds, and so people can interpret that as them not doing their job or not being effective, but sometimes it's just dependent. If there's no resources, they can't refer anybody anywhere. You have to go to the office for assessment. You can schedule it, but they do have some drop-in hours. But again, you kind of have to be proactive in planning. And you have to meet the homeless definition in order to receive help. And the federal definition for homelessness does not identify individuals as doubled up as homeless. So if you're staying with friends or family as a way to get off the street, you aren't considered homeless. So you're getting your needs met on one end by trying just to stay with someone so you're not on the streets, but then you aren't necessarily able to get into a shelter because of all of the barriers. And so it is really a frustrating way to navigate. So just that one basic, not basic, I mean, it is one of those essential like hierarchy of needs. It's very, very rudimentary need for people. But in theory, when you're asking the question, if you were homeless, what would you do? I'd stay with somebody or I'd go to a shelter. Isn't necessarily a valid plan of action. It might sound good, but thinking about the clients that we might potentially serve in the future, these are things they have to navigate within their physical environment. I threw up on here, this is a map of downtown. And so Division is kind of the main street in downtown Grand Rapids for services for individuals who are homeless or low income. And so I kind of put stars on here because so here, hopefully you can see my cursor. Here's Division, here's Dégagé, here's Guiding Light, here's Meltrotter. So here are the 3 homeless shelters in Grand Rapids. The other stars, this one, that's Cherry Health. That's where I used to work. So that's kind of just kind of thinking about location. So here's homeless shelters. This is a medical clinic where it's very close to walk to be able to receive medical care. So that's kind of a cool element of this environment. Here is a low income, so subsidized housing here, subsidized housing here. So this is the Weston. This is Sheldon, I believe. So yeah, so just kind of looking like this is, if you're homeless or you're low income in the city, this is often the places where you are looking to find housing because the subsidized obviously is reduced rent. And it's easier, but there's long waiting lists there. But if we're going back to the conversation that we had about the biological person and lower socioeconomic status, and how that impacts health, because sometimes there's not access to healthy food. There is no big grocery stores anywhere near here. There's Lucky's, Lucky's like, what's the word? Convenience store, I know, is right over here. I think it's right here next to Cherry, because these are also other subsidized housing. There's a gas station on the corner further down Division and Wealthy where a lot of individuals can go. So if you're looking on trying to promote health and wellness, there's not a lot of opportunities when you're in this physical environment. And so if you're thinking about the individual that I referenced earlier who previously lived out on a ranch in very wide open spaces and now he's living on Division, there's not a lot of, the whole physical space has completely changed for him because of how the buildings are and the impact that might have on mental health and anxiety and even just like the noise pollution, thinking about being on a ranch versus being on a very busy street downtown with traffic. Individuals who are out late at night, there's a lot of substance use in the city, and so individuals might be intoxicated, individuals might be engaged in prostitution, and so just thinking about how that physical environment, but there's not a lot of options for individuals who don't have housing, and so this kind of becomes the reality for individuals who are in a housing crisis or could potentially be their reality. So just wanted to give a very concrete and specific example of how our city's physical environment impacts possibly clients that we serve and what that might look like to navigate.